Azure Service Bus is a fully managed enterprise message broker with message queues and publish-subscribe topics. Service Bus is used to decouple applications and services and provides reliable message queuing and durable publish-subscribe messaging. In this video, we will learn more about topics and subscriptions in Azure Service Bus and how to use it from a .NET application. We will learn how to create a topic, how to connect to it from a .NET application, send messages, and also subscribe to messages using subscriptions. We will also learn about filters and actions in Service Bus subscriptions. Hello everyone, my name is Rahul and welcome back to another video in this YouTube channel. If you're new here, I make videos around .NET, Azure, AWS, and DevOps. Without much delay, let's head right into learning more about Azure topics and subscriptions. Since we will be using the topics and subscriptions from a .NET application, let's start with one. Here, I have a default ASP.NET Core Web API application in Visual Studio 2022. This is by default using .NET Core 6. We have the program.cs, the weather forecast class, and also a controller, which is the weather forecast controller. It's inside here, we have the get method that is currently returning a default set of information. Let's go and add a new post method in here so that we can drop a message into the service bus topic. So let's come below the HTTP get and add an HTTP post method. So let's call this with the attribute HTTP post. Let's add a public task and specify the method name as post. This will take in a weather forecast object, which is exactly the same thing that's getting returned in the previous get method. This has a few properties like the date, temperature, summary, etc. So let's take in a weather forecast, call this as data, and start our new method in here. Now, in a previous video where we used Azure Service Bus queues, we saw how to drop this message into a Service Bus queue and do some processing from there. This might be useful if you have a long-running process anytime a new weather forecast data is getting posted. Now, if you're simply writing it to a database, you might do that as well here and publish a new message which says a weather forecast object was added. So in this case, let's assume we have some code here that's already writing this to a database. To keep the scope of this video to just the service bus topics, I will be ignoring this part. Now, as soon we have saved a new weather forecast object into our database, we can publish an event or a message which says weather forecast added. Now, this message might be important for other services in our applications. Let's say we want to send an email or build a report or other similar actions whenever a new weather forecast is getting created. So let's go and define an event first so that we can publish that right after writing this to a database. So let's go into the weather forecast class and create a new class inside this. Let's call this public class weather forecast added. Now this can have a GUID property, which is the ID of the new weather forecast that's getting added. Let's add in a date. So we can call this the date and time for which the weather forecast was added. So let's name this as for date. And also we can have a created date time. So let's add another date time and call this created at. Or even we can keep it as created date time. Now that we have the message defined, let's go back to our controller and publish this message. So let's say var message is equal to new weather forecast added and pass in the properties that we just defined. So we have the GUID ID. So in this case, let's assume that we already have the ID after writing to the database. I'll simply assume that's going to be a GUID.new GUID. We can specify the created datetime as the datetime.udc now and the for date from the data that we have received. So let's say data dot and the date from there. Now these are the three properties that we need for our message or the event that's getting published whenever a weather forecast is added. We need to publish this to a service bus topic. Now before we go into creating a service bus topic, let's understand a bit more about topics. And even before that, let's see why we are not publishing this into a message queue. Now anytime we are publishing into a message queue, the message is always consumed by one receiver. In the case where we wanted to process the adding of the new weather data, this was okay because we only had one receiver that would be processing that particular message, which would end up adding this into a database. But once we have published the event, we have multiple receivers that's interested in that specific event or the new message, which is the weather forecast created. In these cases, publishing to a queue might not help us here. What we need is to publish to a topic. A topic allows us to have multiple receivers to receive the same message. This acts as multiple queues stacked up each other, each one of which has its own receiver, but a single message that's getting dropped will get delivered to all these queues. This is exactly what we want in this case, because whenever a new weather data is getting created, we want an email to be sent, we also want a report to be regenerated, and other actions or receivers that's interested in that event or the message. In short, a queue is often used for point-to-point communication, whereas topics are useful in cases where you need to publish and subscribe for different messages. So as you can see, topics can have multiple independent subscriptions which can attach to the topic and otherwise work exactly like queues from the receiver side. So the receiver would just see this as a queue, but for the sender, it's just a topic, and it publishes it in all these queues inside of this. Like before, when we saw Azure Service Bus queues, we have to create the topics inside a namespace. A namespace is a container for all messaging components in Service Bus, be it Service Bus queue, topics, subscriptions, etc. Everything lives within the namespace. So let's head over to the Azure portal and start creating a new topic inside a namespace. Here in the Azure portal, I am under my resource groups, so let's create a new resource group to get started. So I'll name this as delete 3 because I've been lazy not being deleting the other 2 resource groups that I previously wanted to be deleted. So let's name this as delete 3 and specify the region as Australia, which is the closest to me in this case. You can pick whatever region is closest to you or that you want this resource group to be created in. Let's take review and create and click create. Now this creates the new resource group. So let's navigate into that and create a new service bus namespace. So let's click create and search for service bus. Let's click create, which prompts us to create a new namespace in service bus. So it's already under delete 3. So let's specify the namespace name. So let's call this as YouTube-demo, which needs to be unique. So that doesn't exist and we can create a new one. Let's also choose this as Australia East and select the pricing tier. You have different available options, and if you want more details, you can always click this link, which will show you the features between these different options. Now in this case, since I want to use topics, this is only available from the standard pricing tier. So let's select the standard pricing tier and click review and create. Once that's confirmed, we can click create. This creates a new service bus namespace for us, which is basically a container for all our messaging components. The deployment is complete, so let's click Go to Resource. Here we are in the new Service Bus namespace that we just created, YouTube-demo. On the left side, if you scroll down, you can see 2 entities, which is queues and topics. In a previous video, we explored about the Service Bus queues. So let's go to topics and create a new topic. Let's name this as Weather Forecast Added. So let's say Weather Forecast Added. Now this asks for the maximum topic size, so let's leave it at 1 GB. Let's also leave the time to live as 14 days. All the other options, let's for now leave it as default and click create. We have a new topic created in here, so we can navigate to this and see some details inside this. So it'll have all the properties that we just selected, where it specifies 1 GB as the maximum size, the time to live as 14, and the other options that we selected. We can now start sending messages to this topic and see how it works. To connect to this topic, we will need a connection string. If we navigate back to the namespace, under the shared access policies, we can retrieve the connection string to connect to this. So select the root managed shared access key and copy the connection string from here. Now this by default gives us the ability to manage, send and listen. If you want to restrict access, you can always click Add and select the appropriate access that you want and generate a new connection string. So let's for now copy this primary connection string and keep this for use in our application. Now in the Azure Service Bus queue video, I show you how to use managed identity so that you can remove any need for this connection string from your application. To keep things simple in this video, I will be using the connection string all throughout. Now, if you want to learn about managed identity and how to use it for Azure Service Bus, you can check out the video on queues and use exactly the same way to connect to Azure Service Bus topics. Because for both of them, we are basically connecting to the Service Bus namespace, and the topics and queues lives inside that. So let's come back to our application and start sending this message into this topic that we just created. Now, like before, in the Service Bus queue video, we will need a Service Bus client which is coming from a NuGet package. So let's go to the Azure Service Bus topics, right click and say Manage NuGet Packages. Let's go to Browse and search for Service Bus. What we need is the azure.messaging.servicebus library. So let's click this and select Install. The package is successfully installed. So let's come back to our weather forecast controller and create a new client using the Service Bus library that we just created. So let's specify here where client is equal to new Service Bus client, which comes from the NuGet package that we just installed, which is azure.messaging.servicebus. So let's add in the usings, use the default constructor. This takes in a connection string. So let's name this as connection string and create a new property right above this, which is going to be connection string. We have this already copied in our clipboard. Let's auto hide this. So if you want to see your clipboard manager, at any point you can press the Windows key and the V. This will open up the clipboard manager. So here I have only one value copied. So let's select that to paste it into this current location. So we have the connection string and we are successfully connecting it to the Service Bus client. Now to send a message, we need to create a sender. So let's say where sender is equal to client.createSender and specify the topic name that we want to connect to. In this case, this is going to be weather forecast added. So let's specify weather forecast -added. This is the one that we just created as a topic inside our namespace. So if we come back to the topics, you can see this under here. Now to send the message, we need to specify the message. So let's say where message is equal to new Service Bus message. So let's call Service Bus message, which has different overloaded constructors. So if we look at the different options, we can see this takes a string body. So let's specify the body and create a string body in this case. So let's define where body is equal to and specify the message. Since this has to be a string, let's use JSON serializer and convert our new message into this particular body. So let's write JSON serializer. So this comes from the system.text.json. So let's add that usings and specify the serialize method. This automatically specifies to use the message. So let's use the message. Now we have the body, which is getting created into this message. Since we already have a message defined above, let's call this as Service Bus message. So let's see SB message for Service Bus message. Now once we have the message created, let's use the sender and then send this message. We can use the send method and we have two overloads, which is the send message async and also send messages async. This is when you want to send multiple messages. Now since in this case we only want to send one message, let's use the send message async method and specify the message that we have just created. So let's call send message and pass in the Service Bus message that we have just created. Now since this is an asynchronous method, let's add an await in here. We can also make the method async so that this works perfectly fine. Now we currently have the connection string hard-coded in our code, but I highly recommend not doing this in your applications. If you are building on the Azure infrastructure, you can check out my video on 5 different ways on how you can manage sensitive information. In this specific case, you could use managed identity that I walked through in the Azure Service Bus queues videos. But for now, we'll just leave it as connection string to keep things straight and easy. Let's click F5 to see this in action. I'll put a breakpoint in here so that we can debug. The application is running successfully. It opens up the default Swagger UI, which is already set up with our ASP.NET Core application. Here we can see the get method and also the new post method that we added. So let's click post, select try it out and send a new dummy message to this new endpoint. So let's click execute, which drops the message into our weather forecast controller. So we have the message here. So let's step through this. Here we first create the connection string. We create the client from the connection string. We create a sender using the topic name that we have. So in the above line, we are connecting to the service bus namespace, and now we have created a sender for this topic explicitly. Once we have the sender, we are creating the service bus message and sending this to this particular topic. Now this is all working fine, and it has successfully sent the message to this particular topic. Let's navigate back to our service bus topic in Azure portal and navigate to this topic. Under here, on the left side, we can go to the Service Bus Explorer to explore this particular topic. Now here we have three options to send, receive, and peek. In case of send, this is typically to send a new message to this topic. Receive is to get the message from the topic and remove from it if it is successfully processed. Now peek is an option to get the message but not have it removed from the topic. So it will still be there available for other people to use. Now to receive, we always need to select a subscription. But since we haven't created a subscription, we cannot receive any of the messages that we have sent. Now to do that, we'll have to go and create a new subscriber. On the left side, we can navigate to subscriptions and create a new subscription. So let's click the plus subscription button. Here we can create the new subscription where we will be subscribed to messages on this topic. Now let's say this is the case where we want to send email. So let's name this as send email for the name. We can specify a maximum delivery count. This is the maximum number of times this message will be sent to this particular receiver in case it's not able to process it the first time or the second time. So let's specify this as 3, which means it will be sent 3 times. It also has the auto delete, which is currently 14 days, and you can also specify never auto delete, etc. We will leave this as the default. These same properties we also saw when we created a queue in the Azure Service Bus. Now some of these properties and its impacts I detailedly explain in that video, which I highly recommend checking it out. Now let's leave all these properties as default and click create. So this will create a new subscription for this topic with the name Send Email. Now that we have successfully created a subscription, we can still see the message count is 0. This is because the message to the topic was sent before the subscription was created. This subscription will only receive the messages that's now sent from now on. It will not be getting the historical messages that was sent to it. This is an important thing to keep in mind when we are using subscriptions and topics. So let's come back to our Swagger UI and click execute again. This is going to send the message again to this particular topic. Now this time, if we come back to the Azure portal and click refresh, we can see the message count has increased by 1. This is because we've just sent a message and that has been received into this topic. Let's click the send email subscription, and here we can use the same Service Bus Explorer preview which is specific for this particular subscription. If we go into peek and select peek, we can see the message inside of here. Now since we only have one message, this shows one message. If we scroll to the right, we can see the ID, the for date, and the created date time. These are the 3 properties that's there on the message or the event weather forecast created. Let's see how we can consume this from a .NET application. Now anytime a message is dropped onto this particular topic, which gets received into this subscription, we might want to trigger off an email. Now this could happen in a completely different process. Now it could be a web job, a background task, or even an Azure function. Now in this particular case, I will show you from an Azure function. If you're new to Azure Functions, I highly recommend checking out my video on Azure Functions, which walks through the entire setup and the different properties and ways you can set up an Azure function. So let's navigate back to our solution, stop this, go to Solution Explorer and add a new Azure Service function. So let's right click on the solution, select Add and say New Project. Now since I've recently created a function, it's showing up in my recent project templates. If not, you can search for here and click Add. So let's say Next and let's name this Weather Data Processor. Now within this Weather Data Processor, we can add the Send Email function as well. So let's click Create. And we get to choose the trigger for this Azure function. Now earlier we used Service Bus Queue trigger, but in this particular case we want the Service Bus Topic trigger. So this is whenever a message is added to the specified Service Bus topic. On the local environment, for the storage account that a function needs, we will use the storage emulator, which is already installed on my system. Now, to run Azure functions locally, you will have to install Azure Core Tools, which I have already installed on this machine. I'll put a link to it in the descriptions below. So let's specify the connection string name. In this case, let's say weather data connection. Let's specify the topic name, which is weather-data-added, which is the new topic that we created, and also the subscription name, which is the send email. So if we come back to our Azure portal, you can see this is the subscription that we created, and this subscription lives under this particular topic, which further lives under the YouTube demo namespace. So let's come back and click Create. This will create a new Azure function project. So let's go to the Solution Explorer. Here we see that there is a function1.cs, the host.json, and local settings.json. You can learn more about this in my video on Azure functions. To keep going, let's come to this particular function, which has the service bus trigger created here. So this means anytime a message is dropped on this service bus with this particular topic and this particular subscription, this function will get invoked. This also uses the connection. So let's specify this connection in our local settings as well. So let's come back to the local settings.json. Under the values, let's create a new key. So let's specify weather data connection. We already have the connection string in our clipboard manager. So let's press Windows V and click the connection string. Now again, we have the connection string specified directly inside the config, which is not a good practice. For local development, you can use Secrets Manager, which I show you in another video. You can also check up the Azure Service Queues videos where I use Managed Identity for an Azure function as well. For now, let's keep it inside this local settings.json and come back to our function1.cs. This function by default is injecting in the iLogger, which is into an instance class. Now I haven't wired up this iLogger for this function, so let's use the static way of creating a function. Now if you want to learn about dependency injection and how to set it up in an Azure function, I have a separate video on that where I walk you through the entire process. Now to keep things simple here, let's make this as a static class and define a static method as our Azure function. So let's specify static on both the class and the function name. So let's remove this constructor and let's remove this extra property as well. Now to get the logger, we can add a logger property inside the run method. So let's specify iLogger and specify logger. Let's use logger instead of the underscore logger. Now the Azure Functions runtime will automatically inject this for us. This is how dependency injection is done if you're using a static function. Now again, if you want to use dependency injection the same way we use in ASP.NET Core, highly recommend checking out the other video on dependency injection in Azure Functions. Now that we have everything set up, let's run this and see if everything's working as expected. So let's go into the Solution Explorer, right-click and set Startup Projects. In this case, we want multiple startup projects. We want both the service bus topics and the weather data processor to be started. So let's click both and select Apply. I've just noticed that we've got the wrong topic name. So if we navigate back, what we have here is weather forecast added. So let's change this to be weather forecast instead of weather data.added. So let's specify weather forecast, which is the topic name, and the send email is the correct subscription. So let's come back, put a breakpoint in here and run this application. Both the Azure Functions and the Web API is running. So we have the Swagger UI and the CLI where the Azure function is booting up. Now since we already have a message in our queue, the function directly comes to the breakpoint as soon as it starts. So if we look at the my.sb.message, you can view this and we can see all the properties that we sent as part of our first event into the topic. So it has the for date, ID, and also the created date time. So let's click close and continue this execution. Now this logs the message into the console, so we can see that here. So it says C# service bus topic trigger function and also logs the message, which is exactly what we are doing inside our function. Now here you could write the code to send an email connecting to an email service or using your SFTP server. Now that's completely up to you. So if we come back to our service bus topics in our portal and refresh this, we can see there is no more messages in this queue because we have read and processed it successfully. So if we click peek again, this is going to return no messages. If we come back to our Swagger UI, go to post, click try it out and select execute again, this is going to send a new message. So that's hit the breakpoint. Let's remove this breakpoint and say F5. Now as soon as this message hits the topic, it gets delivered into the subscriber and that gets picked up by our Azure function. So you can see the Azure function breakpoint is also hit here. So let's click F5 and that will log the message in the console. Now in cases where we don't successfully process this message, it can throw an exception. So let's say if my SB message dot contains 2020 as a word. So let's say if there is the year 2020 inside this, we'll throw an exception. So let's say throw new exception and say cannot process for year 2020. Now this is simply for demo purposes. In your application, you might have various reasons where exceptions could occur. Let's see what happens when an exception is thrown. So let's click F5 to run both the applications and send a new message to the queue. Let's navigate to weather forecast, try it out and specify 2020 in the date. So let's change this and specify 2020. Let's click execute, which is going to get picked up by our Azure function. Now this throws an exception here because the MySB message contains 2020. As soon as we resume this execution, the message is going to get delivered again. So this is going to happen 3 times because we specified the delivery count as 3. So now we have the second time, this message again throws an exception and then it comes back. Now in this specific case, since this is throwing an exception based on the message content, it's going to keep getting thrown again and again until it reaches the maximum delivery count. But in cases where it's certain processing errors because unavailability of, let's say, the SFTP service or the external email service, you could always retry and send it again in the next try. So let's click F5 and this is again going to throw the exception and then it's finally going to give up because it's delivered 3 times. Now if we come back to the Azure portal and click refresh, you can see here that this message has come into the dead letter queue. Now this message was tried to be processed, but it couldn't be, so it moved to a dead lettered queue. Now if we go under peek, select dead letter and select peek, this is going to show this one message from the dead letter queue. Here you can also see that the delivery count is 4 because it tried 3 times to deliver to the subscriber and then put it inside the dead letter queue. As a team, you can monitor your dead letter queue, see what the errors are and reprocess it manually if required. So let's click close and come back to our .NET application. Let's stop this. Now let's say we have another function which needs to process a report every time a weather forecast is getting added. So let's simulate this by copy pasting this function and creating a new function. So let's call this as run1. We will name this as update report. To differentiate between these two in the logs, let's change this to say send email. So let's say send email and let's make this updating report. Now for the update report, let's create a different subscription so that it's not looking at the same send email subscription. So let's assume this will be named as update report and come back to our Azure portal and create a new subscription. So let's navigate back into the weather forecast added topic and create a new subscription. So under the subscriptions where we already have the send email, let's click plus subscription and add in the update report. So let's add update dash report, leave the maximum delivery count as 3 and leave the other values as default. Let's click create. Now this is going to create a new subscriber into this particular topic. Now we have 2 subscribers inside this particular topic. Let's come back to Visual Studio and run these applications. Now we have 2 functions, one which is listening to the update report subscription and the other one to the send email subscription. Both of them are belonging to the same topic, which is why it is using the weather forecast added. Both the applications have started, so let's go to the post endpoint, select try it out and click execute. Now this message is going to go into the topic. It's getting picked up by the update report and it's going to log the updating report. This is also going to get picked up by the send email. So you can see the other function has also been invoked and it's going to log the send email. Now if we come to the console, we can see both of these getting logged here. We can see the send email and also the updating report. Both these functions are invoked whenever a new message is sent to the topic. So we have one sender, in this case the Swagger UI, which is sending the message to the topic, and that is getting picked up by the two subscriptions, which is triggering these two Azure functions. Now let's say the updating report doesn't care about the year 2020, so let's remove that and just throw the exception in the send email function. So let's run this and see what happens in this particular case. Both the applications are running, so let's go into weather forecast, try it out, and select the year as 2020. Now this is going to throw an exception in the sending email, but going to get processed fine with the updating report. Now the update report has invoked, so let's click F5, which successfully completes, and also the function is getting invoked. Now this throws an exception, so it gets the message redelivered for 3 times. So let's continue the execution 3 times, and that will end up into the dead letter queue. So if we go back to the console, you can see this exception getting logged, and the update report was called successfully. Now if we come back to the Azure portal and refresh, we can see here the message count is 2 because it has 2 messages in the dead letter queue. Let's go into the send email, select the Service Bus Explorer preview and select peek to see these messages. Now if we look at the subscription, there will be no messages, but let's select the dead letter and select peek. Here you can see both these messages which has 2020 in the text. However, if we come back to weather forecast added, under the update report, there are no messages inside the dead letter queue. So here you can see the messages as 0. This is because the message got processed successfully in that particular subscription. Whenever we create subscribers, we can also define what messages they want to receive from the topic. This is specified using filters. So we can filter out the message based on different properties and then decide whether to add it for this particular subscriber or not. Now let's see this in action. Let's come back to the Azure portal. Under the update report subscription, let's go to overview and we can create a filter inside here. So here we have the filters and it by default has a $default filter. So let's select this and this says 1 is equal to 1. Which is true for all the case, which means all the messages is currently getting delivered to this particular subscription. Let's delete this and add a new filter. So let's say delete and click the add filter. In this case, let's say we want the report to be updated only if it's for the month of December. So let's say this as December. Let's specify an application property, which we will do in a moment. So let's specify month is equal to December. Now here, you can see this is specified as a filter type SQL filter. So this uses a syntax very similar to SQL. Now, if you have been writing SQL queries, this is something you would have written in the where clause if you wanted to check if the month is December. Let's click Save Changes and go and define this month in the application property. To do that, let's come back to our .NET application. Let's come to the weather forecast controller, and whenever we are sending the message, we can add a month property. Now let's say in the SB message dot application properties dot add and specify the month property. Now let's give the name as month. Let's use the data dot date dot toString and get the month from there. So in this case, we want to format it as the full month. So let's specify M, 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 and M. This is giving the month full format, which will add a new property to this particular message. Let's run this to see this in action. Both the applications are running. So let's go into weather forecast, try it out, and click execute. Now in this case, the month is January. So let's click execute. And you can see it's immediately picked up by our send email. So let's click F5. Now since this is for 2022, it successfully processes this message. However, we notice that the update report was not called. This is because this was not for the month of December. So let's come back to the UI and change this and specify 2021 and say this is for December. So I'll specify 12 and click execute. Now in this case, you can see the update report was immediately picked up because this is for the month December. So whenever we are sending the message, this has the December property inside there. To see the month property in the queue, let's come back to Solution Explorer and let's just run the Web API application. So I'm explicitly right-clicking that project and saying to debug that, so that the Azure function is not run and the message doesn't get picked up automatically. Now the Web API is running, so let's navigate here. Let's say try it out and select execute. Now this should have one message with January, and let's specify this as 12 and make this as 2021 and click execute. Let's come back to our Azure portal. Let's refresh this queue and we can see that there's one message in here. Now let's make sure to use peak and say peak under this subscription. It retrieves that one message, so let's select that. And here we can see the month December as a custom property. Now this is exactly the property that we are checking on in the SQL query that we just wrote as the filter. Based on your application needs, you can update this filter and make sure only certain messages is picked up by the subscriber. Now if we come back to the send email message, we would have two messages inside the queue that we'll also have for January. So let's come back to the Service Bus Explorer, select peak and say peak on this subscription. Now if we select the first one, this is for January, which didn't appear in the update report because that got filtered out. Let's come back to our .NET application, stop this and run both the applications. Now as soon as the Azure function is going to run, it's going to pick up both the messages. So let's remove this breakpoint and the Azure function processes those messages successfully. Now the updating report is only called for the December because that's the only message that came into its subscription. If we come back to the Azure portal, let's go back to the update report subscription where we added the filter and add one more filter to it. Now let's say we are also interested in months where the value starts with M and A. That will include March and May. So let's click add a filter and specify MA-months as the name. Now inside the SQL filter, you can write month. You can use the like query. So you can specify like, just like we would have used in SQL, and specify MA and also a percentage. Now this is going to use the wildcard. So any months that starts with MA is going to be filtered. Now since we have two filters in this case, it is going to use an OR condition and combine these two. So if it matches any of these properties, it will pick up this message. Let's see this in action. Now we have the application already running. So let's open up both of these. Let's click the post method, try it out and select the same January month. Now this is going to be picked up only by the send email. So we can see here that there is the send email. The update report was not called. Now if we come back and make this as 03, which is going to be March, and click execute, this is going to be picked up by both the updating report and also the send email. Now if we do the same for May, which is going to be 05, so let's specify 05 and click execute. This again is going to be picked up by both. So you can see here the for date is also 05 and the updating report was called. The same is going to work for December, which is going to be 12. So let's click execute and that gets successfully updated by the report as well. Now we are successfully filtering based on two conditions, which is months starting with MA and also the ones with December. So it's using an OR condition and putting one message into it. So these filters that we added didn't have any associated actions with it. Now an action is something that can modify a message before it drops it into the selected subscription. Now let's say we have a filter. Once it's filtered, we can also add custom properties as an action. So whenever there is a filter without an action, it's combined using an OR condition. But if it's an action, it will produce a copy of the message. So if you have two actions, you are going to get two messages into the subscription queue. Now let's see how we can create an action when we also create the filter. Now I couldn't find a way to create an action from the UI portal. Now if I am missing something, please drop in the comments below. However, you can create an action using various different mechanisms. So if we come here to the actions section, you can see actions also uses a SQL-like expression. Now there's different ways how you can create an action. So you can use the .NET code or Java or JavaScript, etc. In this case, I have a PowerShell script which is using the AZ service bus topic subscription rule to create an action. If you go into that, you can see the format in which you can use to specify and create a new action. Now I have already written this, so let me copy and paste this into my console and walk you through it. Here I have the AZ service bus topic subscription rule create, specify the resource group, in our case it's delete 3, the namespace which is YouTube-demo, the topic name which is the weather forecast added, subscription name which is update report, and specify a name for this new filter and action that we are creating. So we can specify -- name and specify the -- action SQL expression, which is now setting a property. So here you can see I'm using the set, which is very similar to the SQL format. And I'm adding in a new property, let's say custom property, and setting the value AAA in this particular case. I'm also adding a filter SQL expression, which is for the month December. So let's make sure to put this in quotes as well so that it works as expected. Now let's specify month is equal to December. Now this gets filtered when the month is December. Before we run this, let's come back and delete the December filter that we already have. So let's click yes and delete the December filter. Now we have only the MA-months one. Let's come back to our console and run this from here. You will have to configure the AZ command line for this to work on your local machine. I'll put a link for the description below. Now this is successfully executed and returns the response from the API that this has just called. If we come back to the subscription and let's click refresh, and here we can see the test new is successfully created. If we select that, we can see the SQL filter with the month December. However, we are still not able to see the action in the UI portal. Now assuming this is all set successfully, let's try and run a message and see what happens. Let's come back to our .NET application. Now in this particular cases, when we wrote the Azure function, we represented the message as a string, which means we always get the body in the content. Now if you look at the Azure Service Bus trigger, you can use it in different ways. So if we specify it as a string, we'll get the message which is the text. You can also specify byte array if it's a binary data, or we can specify the service bus received message since I'm using one of the latest libraries. So let's copy this service bus received message. So let's copy that. Let's come back to our application, and instead of string, let's use that in here. So let's specify that. Now to make sure this is available, let's go into our Azure functions and let's make sure to update our NuGet packages. So let's right click and say manage NuGet packages. Now in here, if we go under updates, we can see an update to the service bus extensions NuGet package. So let's select that and make sure it's above the 5 version. Because if we come back to our documentation, we saw that this was apps using 5.0.0 or greater. So let's come back, select this and select update. This same update to the NuGet package is what was required to use managed identity when we did the service bus queues video. So once that is set up, let's come back to our functions.cs. Let's make sure the appropriate usings is added for the service bus received. So this is coming from azure.messaging.servicebus. Now once that is all there, let's click F5 and make sure this is running as expected. Both the apps are running. So let's select post, say try it out, specify the year 2021 and specify the month as 12 because December is where we have written the query for. Let's click execute. This gets picked up immediately by the update report. So if we expand the my SB message, we can see this has additional properties in here. So if we also expand the application properties, we can see our newly written custom property inside of this. Now this is because whenever this rule was matched, which is also specified in this property by the rule name and specifies test new, it added a new property before putting this into the queue. Now we have a message that is slightly modified by this particular rule, which has a filter and also an action. Now you also have the month December, which was an application property that was added by the sender. So if we continue the execution, that is going to log the message into the console. Now, whenever an action is there, it produces a copy of this message. Now, if you have multiple actions, it is going to create multiple copies. If we are to add one more action to this particular subscription, we will get two messages in that case. Let's see this in action. So let's come back to our console. Let's create one more action in here. So let's update the name as test name 2. And let's specify the custom property to be BBB in this particular case. We can also specify the month to be the like property. So let's say month like. And the same way it did for MA, let's make it as MA and %. So this is going to do for any months that starts with MA. So let's press enter, which is going to create a new rule, which is test new 2. Now this is successfully created. So let's go back to our subscription and refresh it to see that. And we can see the test new 2. This has the month like MA. Now we already have a MA month filter in here, which is also going to filter and put a message into the queue. Now in this particular case, we're going to get two messages whenever we drop a message with MA. This is something that you need to be aware of if you're using actions. Now if you come back to the documentation, you can see, consider this scenario where you have a subscription with 5 rules, where 2 rules contains actions and 3 rules don't contain the actions. In this case, these 3 rules gets combined using the OR condition that we saw initially, and for each of these 2 rules, it will put an independent message. So you can see in total you will get 3 messages, one for each of these rules that contains actions and the one for this combined one with the 3 rules. This is all considering that these filters is applicable for that message. If one of the conditions filters out the message, then you would definitely not get that message into the queue. Let's see this in action. So let's come back to our queue. Let's put a message for the month of MA. So let's say 03 and click execute. Now the message has hit. So let's expand this my SB, and you can see this has the application properties which specifies no rule in this case, which means this was picked up by the rule which didn't have an action. This is the one where we explicitly added it from the UI. Now if we continue the execution, we are going to get one more breakpoint hit. So if we expand this time, the application properties is going to have more values. This time you can see it has the custom BBB as the property set, and it also specifies the rule name, which is test new 2. So if we continue execution, that is going to run successfully. So in our case, one of the messages was delivered because of this rule, which was having MA months, which didn't have any rule name because it didn't have an associated action. Now the one with the test new 2, it also updated the property custom, which set it to BBB, and also had the rule name. This is something you have to keep in mind when you use actions with your subscriptions. I hope this helps you to get started with Azure Service Bus, topics and subscriptions. We learned how to create a new topic, create subscribers for it, and also use it from a .NET Azure function. We saw how to create filters and also to use actions with it. If you like this video, please make sure to hit the like button. If you have any questions, feedback or comments, please make sure to drop them in the comments below. If you want to be subscribed or future such videos, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It also helps me to grow this YouTube channel. Thank you and see you soon.